I want you to understand something before I start. When people ask me what it felt like to be there, to actually be there on the ground at Karath Station when everything changed, I never know how to answer right away. I usually sit with it for a second, maybe two, and then I tell them the same thing every time. I tell them it didn't feel like history. It never does when you're inside it. It felt like cold metal under my boots and recycled air that tasted faintly of iron wash and burnt polymer, and the particular kind of silence that settles over a military outpost at 400 hours when even the machines seem like they're holding their breath. That's what it felt like. Not grand, not cinematic, just cold and quiet and very, very real. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You want the whole thing, so let me go back to the beginning. Let me go back to the part that still makes me a little angry when I think about it too hard. The part where they were laughing at us. The Verk had been in contact with humanity for about 11 years before the Karath incident. 11 years of careful, cautious diplomatic exchange, trade agreements, technology-sharing protocols, the usual slow machinery of interstellar politics grinding its gears. 11 years of humanity being welcomed, in a manner of speaking, into the broader network of the galactic conclave. And in those 11 years, the Verk had formed an opinion of us. That opinion was not flattering. I don't say that with bitterness, I'm past that now mostly. But it's important to understand what the Verk thought of humans if you're going to understand why what happened at Karath hit them the way it did. You need to know the shape of the misconception before you can appreciate the force of its shattering. The Verk are tall. That's the first thing anyone notices. 7 feet on average, slender but dense with hard muscle beneath those pale silver-blue hides of theirs. 4-eyed, 2 primary eyes forward-facing like ours, 2 lateral ones that give them nearly full peripheral vision. Their homeworld, Verk Prime, sits on the inner edge of a temperate zone around a slightly cooler star than Sol. It's a stable world, predictable seasons, mild tectonic activity. The kind of place where civilization grows steadily and without too many catastrophic interruptions. They had never really had to fight for survival, not in the way we had. Oh, they had wars. They had territorial conflicts and resource disputes and ideological schisms like every civilization does. But their evolutionary history was gentler than ours. Their apex predators were smaller. Their climate swings were narrower. They never had an ice age that nearly wiped them out, never had an asteroid impact that spent 10 million years restructuring their food chain. They emerged from their planet with high intelligence, strong social structures, and a reasonable degree of physical capability. But they emerged without something that humanity carried in its bones. They emerged without the specific flavor of desperation that shaped us. Now the Verk were not stupid. They understood on an intellectual level that humans had a difficult evolutionary history. They could read our biology, examine our stress hormone profiles, review the archaeological records we shared. They understood that humans had fought hard for every inch of their existence. What they couldn't understand, what they fundamentally could not process, was what that had done to us. There's a Verk diplomat, a woman named Thesavril Kian, who later wrote a memoir about the pre-Karath years. She was honest enough in it to be embarrassing, which I respect. She wrote, "We observed the human soldiers with curiosity but not concern. They were small. Their reflexes were adequate. They carried weapons with a kind of intensity that struck us as performative, as though the display of ferocity was itself the point, rather than any real capacity for it. We had seen their casualty rates in their own historical wars. We had seen how easily they broke when pressed. We concluded that the stories humans told about themselves were exactly that, stories, myths, a species building a legend around its own mediocrity." Mediocrity. That word. Thesavril is actually a friend of mine now. We had dinner on Verk Prime about 2 years after Karath, and I read that passage aloud to her, and she covered her face with both primary hands and made a sound that I've come to recognize as the Verk equivalent of a groan. She said in that careful, precise Verk-accented trade standard she uses, "I was so confident. I had reviewed all the data. I believed I understood." I told her, everyone who's ever underestimated humans has said exactly that. She did not disagree. The station was called Karath 7, but everyone just called it Karath. It sat at the Lagrange point between the 3rd and 4th planet in the Sharath system, a deep space installation, primarily research-oriented, with a secondary function as a logistics waypoint for trade routes moving through the outer rim of conclave space. It was jointly operated. Verk personnel handled most of the scientific and administrative functions, and a small human expeditionary corps detachment handled security. I was part of that detachment. 23 of us under the command of Captain Orla Mwangi. We reported nominally to both the HEC command structure and to the station's Verk administrative director, a heavy-set, perpetually unimpressed bureaucrat named Devrak Solis. Devrak was not hostile to us exactly. He was something more insidious than hostile. He was dismissive. We existed to him roughly the way a functioning but aesthetically unappealing piece of furniture exists, useful in a basic sense, not worth his real attention. He assigned us to the least consequential posts: internal perimeter monitoring, cargo verification, routine access control. The kind of work that could be done by automated systems, and often was, and where having actual soldiers present was mostly a matter of satisfying some interstellar treaty requirement about joint operations. The Verk security forces on the station, a unit of about 40 called the Sharath Watch, handled everything they considered real security: external threat monitoring, advanced sensor networks, the heavy weapons emplacement at the station's core. They were professional and well-trained, and they were, to a one, utterly confident that nothing would ever require their full capabilities at a remote logistics waypoint. I remember the first time I met their unit commander, a man named Tavrak Essler. He came to our briefing room on our second day aboard, ostensibly to coordinate patrol schedules. He walked in, looked at us, all 23 of us, sitting in folding chairs in our olive and gray HEC duty uniforms, and something happened behind his 4 eyes that I can only describe as a recalibration downward. He had been expecting more, or different, or something other than what he saw. He recovered quickly and he was professionally courteous, but I caught it. Some of my people caught it too. Sergeant First Class Danny Hiroshi, sitting 2 seats to my left, met my eyes and gave me the smallest, flattest look you've ever seen on a human face. The look that said, "Yep, here we go again." Tavrak went through the patrol coordination with brisk efficiency. He allocated us the inner corridors, the residential access points, the cargo bays. He kept the exterior hull monitoring, the docking bay approaches, and the primary sensor suite under Sharath Watch control. When he left, he nodded to Captain Mwangi with the particular politeness that is indistinguishable from condescension. Orla waited until the door closed. "All right," she said, "let's talk about what that was." Nobody played dumb. We knew what it was. Orla had a way of handling these moments that I've tried to emulate for the rest of my career. She didn't let us get angry about it, but she didn't pretend it hadn't happened either. She acknowledged it, named it, and then she redirected. She said, "They think we're decorative, that's fine. We're going to do our jobs with exactly the same standards we would if they thought we were the greatest warriors in the known galaxy. We're going to know this station better than anyone. We're going to run our protocols until we can do them in our sleep. And we're going to be ready, not to prove something, because being ready is what we do." I think about that speech a lot, especially the last part, not to prove something. Because what happened at Karath was never about proving something to the Verk. That was just the side effect. What it was actually about was 11 human beings doing what human beings do when everything goes wrong. Surviving and taking everyone they could with them. The Conclave had been watching the Wrath Collective for about 3 years before Karath. The Wrath were not a signatory civilization. They existed in a loose cluster of systems on the outer edge of mapped space, and they had a complicated history with the Conclave that I won't try to summarize fully here. The short version is, they had grievances, some legitimate, some manufactured, and they had been expressing those grievances with increasing violence for about 18 months. There had been raids, mostly on unmanned installations, resource extraction platforms, automated relay stations. The Wrath were testing boundaries, seeing what the Conclave would defend and how fast. The Conclave had responded with diplomatic pressure and a handful of defensive posture upgrades to the most obviously vulnerable installations. Karath was not considered obviously vulnerable. It was deep in mapped space, well away from the Wrath's usual operating range. It had the Sharath Watch. It had the sensor network. The risk assessment conducted by both Verk and human analysts placed Karath at a low probability of being targeted. Risk assessments are just informed guesses wearing professional clothing. 3 months, 1 week, and 4 days after our arrival at Karath, the wrath hit us. It was 4:12 station time. I was on Inner Corridor Patrol, Sector 7, the residential ring, and I was bored. I'll tell you that honestly. Inner Corridor Patrol at 4:12 when nothing has happened for 3 months and nothing is expected to happen is the specific kind of boredom that starts to feel like a physical weight. Your feet know the path. Your eyes move, but your brain isn't really engaged. You're present in the way a piece of furniture is present. Danny was on the adjacent corridor, Sector 8. We had a check-in protocol every 15 minutes, a quiet click on the comm, not a voice report, just a signal that said still here, still good. I had just done the 400 check-in and was halfway through my next circuit when the station shuddered. Not violently. That's the thing I always emphasize when I describe it. It wasn't a dramatic, movie-style explosion that threw me off my feet. It was more like the station took a breath it wasn't supposed to take, a deep, resonant vibration that I felt more in my chest and the soles of my feet than I heard with my ears. The lights didn't go out. The atmospheric pressure didn't change. If I had been asleep, I might not have woken up from it. But I was awake, and I was trained, and the part of my brain that had been half asleep behind my professional eyes snapped on like a light switch. I stopped walking. That was not mechanical, I thought. That was impact. I had my comm to my face before the thought fully finished forming. Hiroshi, you feel that? Felt it, her voice was already different, clipped, awake in a different way. Origin. Station exterior, hull section, I need sensors. I was already moving, not running yet, but moving with purpose toward the nearest junction panel. Get the others moving. Quiet assembly, no alarms until we know what we're dealing with. Copy. I pulled up the junction panel, the basic version available on Inner Corridor consoles. Not the full tactical display, but enough to show me structural integrity readings for adjacent hull sections. What I saw made something cold settle into my stomach. 3 hull contacts, all on the exterior, all in sections that were, by our patrol allocation, solidly under Sherath Watch coverage. And the Sherath Watch emergency channel was silent. That silence was wrong. If they had detected the contacts, there should have been traffic. Challenge protocols, threat assessment confirmations, rapid response authorization requests. There should have been something. There was nothing. I felt that cold in my stomach get heavier. Either they detected it, and they're handling it so fast they haven't opened comms yet, I thought. Or they detected it and something went wrong, or they didn't detect it. Any of those options was a problem. The third one was the kind of problem that ends with people dying. I opened the captain's channel. Mwangi, her voice was already awake. She'd felt it too. Orla Mwangi slept like a soldier, which is to say she never quite fully slept at all. 3 exterior contacts, Captain. Hull sections 14, 22, and 31. Watch channel is quiet. A pause, I counted it. 1 second, maybe 1.5. Get to me, she said. Bring Hiroshi and Raise. Everyone else holds position and goes to quiet ready. Yes, ma'am. I was running before the channel closed. The command post we'd been given was technically called the Secondary Security Coordination Center, which was a generous name for what was essentially a repurposed storage room with a tactical table and 6 operational screens. The Sherath Watch had the Primary Security Coordination Center, which was a proper operations room with full station sensor coverage, automated threat response systems, and direct links to the weapons emplacements. We had the backup room, which, as it turned out, was what saved us, because the Primary Security Coordination Center was one of the first things the Wrath took out. But I didn't know that yet when I came through the door of our room, finding Orla already at the tactical table and Sergeant Rays. Tamaz Rays, our technical specialist. The one who could make any system talk to any other system if you gave him enough time and the right tools, pulling cables and muttering quietly. What do we have? I asked. Working on it, Tamaz said. Orla looked up from the table. She had her hair pulled back already, which told me she'd been awake. She was wearing her duty uniform, not her fatigues. She'd been awake and working before the impact. Tell me about the contacts. 3 exterior hull separate sections, spaced, not random. 2 evenly distributed to be debris or mechanical failure. Deliberate placement. Yes, ma'am. Boarding. That's my read. She nodded, not surprised, not pleased, just nodded. Processing. Her brain doing what it always did, which was move from here is what is happening to here is what we do about it without much time spent in between. Tamaz, she said, tell me why the watch channel is quiet. Because, Tamaz said, pulling up something on one of the screens, their primary ops center just stopped responding. He turned to look at us, and there was something careful in his expression, the way someone looks when they're delivering bad news and trying not to let the delivery make the news worse. I'm reading a catastrophic power interruption in Section 31. That's where primary ops is located. Whatever hit Hull Section 31, it wasn't small. Orla was quiet for a moment. Casualties. Unknown, the section sealed automatically. Emergency containment, but if the impact took out primary ops, he stopped. They may be gone, I said. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Orla said, pull up everything our sensor package can see. I want to know what's on this station that doesn't belong here. Working on it, Tamaz said again. He meant it differently this time. Danny arrived 30 seconds later, with a compact expression that told me she'd been running. Behind her came two more of ours, Specialist Lyra Acaffer and Corporal Bren Vasquez, both armed, both present in the particular way combat training makes people present when the stakes go up. We were 6 in a backup room trying to figure out what was happening to a station we weren't supposed to be responsible for. And it was 4:17. Part 2, the weight of the unknown. What Tamaz was able to piece together in the next 8 minutes was this. The Wrath had sent 4 insertion craft, small, low-signature vessels, the kind designed specifically to defeat standard Verk sensor suites by riding the thermal shadow of the station's own power grid. Hull sections 14, 22, and 31 had been the breach points, exactly as I'd suspected. The contact at 31 had been larger than the others, a shaped charge designed to disable the primary security coordination center. The Wrath had known exactly where the Sherath Watch would be responding from. The contact at 14 and the contact at 22 were boarding parties. The 4th craft, and this was the thing that made my breath go flat for a second when Tamaz showed it to me, had gone to the station's main power regulation hub in Section 9. Not a breach yet, but parked, waiting. They're not trying to destroy the station, Orla said, looking at the display. Her voice was the kind of calm that you build through training, not the kind that comes naturally. They want to take it. Control the power hub, you control everything, I said. Life support, atmospheric regulation. Internal barriers, all of it. And if they hit Section 9 with anything close to what they hit 31, Danny didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. 63 Verk personnel on the station. Scientists, administrators, medical staff. None of them combat trained. The Sherath Watch, 40 soldiers, had taken a catastrophic hit to their command and control infrastructure. Unknown casualties, unknown current status. 23 human soldiers with inner corridor access. And somewhere between the breach points and the power hub, an unknown number of Wrath boarding personnel moving through our station. All right, Orla said, here's what we're going to do. She told us in the next 4 minutes. I watched the faces of my people as she spoke. Danny, Tamaz, Lyra, Bren, and the 15 others who had filtered in through the door as the quiet-ready order propagated through our comm channels. I watched the way focus settled over each of them like armor being put on. The fear was there. I don't want to give you the impression that we were beyond fear, because that would be both a lie and an insult to what it actually took. The fear was there. It was doing its job, which is to make the body perform. And above it, or maybe through it, was something else. Something that I've spent a lot of time trying to describe accurately. It wasn't bravado, it wasn't recklessness. It was closer to clarity, a specific kind of clarity that comes from the absence of alternative. The Wrath were on our station. Our people, our Verk colleagues, who had looked at us with polite condescension, who had given us the storage room command post and the boring patrols, who were currently locked in research quarters and medical bays with no idea what was moving through the corridors toward them, needed someone to stand between them and whatever was coming. We were the someone. It was that simple, and in that simplicity there was something almost peaceful. I won't give you a real-time account of every minute that followed, because some of it is still classified, and some of it is the kind of thing that loses its texture when you describe it linearly. What I'll give you instead is the shape of it, the moments that mattered, the things I remember most clearly. Orla split us into 3 elements. Element Alpha herself, Danny, Tamaz, and 4 others would move to the Sherath Watch Primary Ops Remnant in Section 31. If there were survivors among the Watch, they needed to find them, assess the damage, and try to restore some version of sensor and communications capability. Element Bravo, 6 people under my command, would intercept the boarding party at Section 14. They would have got through the hull breach by now and would be moving toward the station's interior. The goal was containment. Keep them from reaching the civilian quarters, compress their ability to maneuver, and eliminate or disable as many as possible. Element Charlie, Bren Vasquez, and 4 others would cover Section 22 on the same principle. And Tamaz, before he left with Alpha, would do something to the corridor network between the breach points and Section 9 that would, in his words, make navigation complicated for anyone not using our channel maps. I asked him what that meant. He said, environmental control has access to emergency pressure equalization protocols in every corridor section. You ever seen what happens to visibility when you rapidly cycle atmo pressure in a sealed corridor? I had not. It's like standing inside a cloud, he said. For about 90 seconds, can't see your hand in front of your face. Can we see? We'll have our helmet sensors, they won't. I looked at him, he was already typing. Tamaz, I said, you are a deeply unsettling person. I know, he said. The Section 14 boarding corridor was a service passageway, low ceiling, conduit-lined walls, enough space for 2 people side by side if they didn't mind being uncomfortably close. Not ideal for a firefight. Not ideal for much of anything, honestly, except for the specific task of moving between power conduit access points. Which is why the Wrath had chosen it. I had 6 people. Myself, Specialist Okafor, Specialist Yusuf A, Corporal Priya Mehta, Private First Class Sam Delacroix, and Private First Class Irina Volkova. All armed with the standard HEC personal defense loadout, compact pulse carbines, sidearms, 2 fragmentation and 2 concussion grenades apiece, and the lightweight tactical helmets that included heat sense overlay, low light enhancement, and a simplified sensor feed from whatever network access Tamaz had managed to extend to us. The network access was partial. We had layout data, the corridor map, and thermal imagery if we queried it manually, though with a delay. What we did not have was real-time tracking of the Wrath positions. We were working on best guesses and movement prediction. We set up at a T-junction approximately 40 meters from the nearest confirmed interior access, point from the Section 14 breach. If the Wrath followed standard boarding patterns, which our pre-deployment briefings had described as methodical, progressive, using structural cover and moving in leapfrog pairs, they would pass through this junction on their way to either the civilian quarters in Ring B or the secondary power routing nodes in Corridor 14-7. I put Okafor and Ape in the left branch of the T, 3 meters back with clear sightlines down the approach corridor. Mehta and Delacroix in the right branch, partially behind a conduit junction box that gave maybe 40% cover but was better than nothing. Volkova behind me, covering our rear. I took the position at the junction itself. I want to be precise about this moment because there's a version of this story, the version that gets told at recruiting events and in news features, where I'm at this junction and I'm feeling heroic, like something composed. I was not feeling heroic. I was doing rapid calculations about the distance between myself and the nearest hard cover, the angle of fire from the approach corridor, how long a concussion grenade takes to go from pinpull to detonation in an enclosed space, and whether the conduit boxes were rated to stop a Wrath pulse round. I was sweating. My hands were dry on the carbine grip in the way hands get when the body is diverting resources to the muscles that are about to be needed. My heart rate was elevated. Every sensory system I had was dialed up to maximum, feeding me data, the faint mechanical hum of the conduits, the smell of recycled air, the specific quality of the silence in the corridor ahead. I was afraid, I was very afraid. And I was ready. Those 2 things coexist in humans in a way that I don't think other species entirely understand. Fear doesn't shut down a human who's been trained. It fuels. It sharpens. It takes the soft, comfortable parts of consciousness and burns them away until what's left is very clean and very fast and almost purely functional. We waited. 3 minutes and 40-some seconds. I know because I counted. Not deliberately. Counting is something I do automatically in high-stress situations. A leftover from some training exercise years ago where the instructor made us count out every second of a threat assessment window, and it just got wired in. At approximately 3 minutes and 42 seconds, my helmet sensor feed pinged with a thermal signature. Then 2, then 4. They were in the corridor. The Wrath looked different from what you might expect if you're going off the Conclave's general information releases. Those tend to use images from diplomatic contexts, where the Wrath representatives are in formal attire, and you get the general impression of a species that's somewhat compact, three-armed, with rough-textured carapace covering their dorsal surfaces and softer tissue on their anterior. They look, in those images, like something you might be able to reason with. In combat attire, moving in the dark with weapons raised, they look like something else entirely. I got maybe 2 seconds of visual clarity, the corridor ahead lit by the tactical overlay and the blue-green of heat signatures. And in those 2 seconds I registered. 6 of them, at least, moving in paired formation as our briefings had predicted, with what looked like 2 more hanging back near the breach access. Full environmental suits, carapace plating augmented with tactical armor at the joints and vulnerable anterior sections. The leading pair were carrying something heavier than sidearms. I didn't have time to classify it before I was moving. "Contact," I said, and my voice was steady, which still surprises me a little when I think about it. 6 forward, 2 rear, execute on my mark. Akaffer and Ake would take the left approach, the leading pair. Maida and Delacroix would take the second pair. I would advance and compress the forward line. Volkova would watch the rear and intercept the hangback pair if they moved up. "Mark," I said. "I'm going to skip over some of the details here. Not because I'm trying to protect anyone's sensibilities. We were in a firefight and people got hurt, on both sides, and that's a true and real thing, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. I'm going to skip it because the blow-by-blow of a close-quarters engagement in a corridor is not the part of this that matters. The part that matters is what happened at the end of it." The fight lasted approximately 4 minutes. In a confined corridor with 6 humans who knew the terrain and 8 Wrath who didn't, 4 minutes was, in retrospect, actually quite a long time. The Wrath were good. Better than our pre-deployment briefings had suggested. They adapted fast to the loss of their initial positional advantage, fell back to the breach access, tried to re-establish a choke point. They were also trying, I realized this partway through, which was a cold realization, to call for support. Probably from the craft still parked outside Section 9. Tomaz's atmospheric trick had scrambled their short-range navigation, but it hadn't disrupted communications completely. If they managed to signal the Section 9 team before we contained them, we were going to have a second problem incoming. I made a decision. I'm not going to claim it was a perfectly calculated decision. I'm going to claim it was the decision that the situation demanded, and that I made it before my more cautious brain could talk me out of it. I pushed forward, past the point where the corridor gave me cover, past the point where the tactical manual would have said to hold, and I took the angle that collapsed their choke point from the inside. Delacroix yelled something. I think it was my name. It worked. At the cost of a gash across my left arm from a pulse round that caught the edge of my armor plate, it felt like someone pressing a hot iron against my skin, and my arm went temporarily numb, and then both of those things receded because I didn't have time for them. The Wrath forward position collapsed. The remaining 3 from the initial 6 fell back to the breach access, and Volkova and Ake were already moving to contain the angle from the secondary approach, and then it was over. Not clean, not pretty. The kind of ending that leaves you standing in a corridor that smells wrong and your hands are shaking slightly and you're doing inventory. Which one of my people is on the ground? Which one needs immediate attention? What is the next problem? Akaffer had taken a hit to the shoulder. She was up, but her right arm was out of service. Delacroix had a cut above his eye from shrapnel, shallow, but bleeding freely in the way head wounds do. Otherwise, we were functional. 3 of the 8 Wrath were alive and incapacitated. I had Ake secure them. The other 5 were not our problem anymore. "Section 14 contact contained," I said into the comm. Bravo element status. Bren's voice came back immediately. Section 22 contact contained. 2 WIA walking, we're good. Alpha, I asked. Orla's voice, still working. We've got survivors from the watch. Give me 10 more minutes. We don't have 10 minutes, I said. The Section 9 craft may have received a distress signal. We need to move on that position before they breach. A pause. Agreed, Orla said. Consolidate and move. I'm redirecting Alpha to Section 9 intercept. You and Bravo converge on Section 9 approach from the residential ring. Cut them off from the power hub. Copy, I said. I looked at my people. Akaffer was already getting her arm wrapped with Delacroix's help, his own face bloody, both of them moving with the focused efficiency of people who understand that the current problem is not the final problem. Let's go, I said. Part 3, the myth becomes real. Section 9 approach from the residential ring took us through 3 corridors and a central hub that, under normal circumstances, would have been busy with station personnel at almost any hour. At 500, with the station under some version of emergency lockdown, it was empty except for us. Except for the Verk who were watching us. This is the part of the story I think about differently now than I did when it was happening. The Verk civilian personnel, scientists, administrators, medical staff, had sealed themselves in their quarters per emergency protocol. But the quarters in the residential ring had small observation windows facing the main corridor. And as we moved through that corridor, 6 humans with weapons drawn, 2 of us bleeding, all of us moving at the kind of pace that doesn't have a word for it except purposeful. I could see the faces in those windows. Looking at us, I didn't have time to read expressions, or rather, I didn't have time to process them consciously. But some part of my brain was registering them, filing them away, and when I thought about it later, I realized what I had seen. Not condescension, not the polite dismissal I had gotten used to from Devrak Solis, or the brisk professional courtesy that wasn't of Tavrak Essler. Not any of the varieties of, well, you're here, I suppose that we had been absorbing for 3 months. Something else. I've thought about what to call it. The closest I've come is reassessment in real time, the specific expression of a being in the process of revising a fundamental assumption. Surprise, yes, but under the surprise, something more complicated. Something that looked like it might eventually become relief if it had time to develop. They were watching us move toward the threat, and they were understanding, maybe for the first time, that we were not decorative. I didn't think about it at the time. I thought about Section 9. The wrath from the 4th craft had not waited for a distress signal. I don't know if they received one or not. The investigations afterward couldn't definitively establish the communication sequence. What we know is that by the time Bravo Element, Bren's people, now merged with mine into a consolidated unit of 10, reached the Section 9 approach, the 4th Wrath team was already in the corridor on the other side of the power hub junction. They had 9 personnel. We had 10, but Akaffer was effectively one-armed, and Delacroix was running on adrenaline over a head wound that was going to need attention soon. The Section 9 power hub junction is, I've looked at the technical schematics 100 times since, and the image is very clear in my mind. A circular room approximately 12 meters in diameter, with the power regulation equipment in a protected housing at the center. 4 corridor approaches enter the room at equidistant points, like the cardinal directions of a compass. The ceiling is high, maybe 5 meters, which is unusual for Karath's interior, most of which runs about 3 meters. The high ceiling is there to accommodate the maintenance equipment for the power hub. We came in from 2 corridors. The Wrath came in from 1. Alpha Element, Orla's team, arriving from the Watch Remnant section, came in from the 4th. There was a moment, just before the contact, when all 4 groups were entering the junction simultaneously, and nobody had yet opened fire, and the room was very bright because the power hub's indicator lights were all cycling in some kind of alert sequence. And it was, I don't know how to describe it except to say it was the most surreal 3 seconds of my life. 9 Wrath combat personnel, 14 humans, in a glowing circular room with a humming power hub at its center. Staring at each other. The Wrath commander, I identified him by his position and the communication device on his left arm, which he was trying to activate, made a decision. He calculated, quickly, that 14 humans were not sufficient reason to abort. He may have been working off the same data that had informed Verk military assessments of human combat capability. He may have thought the numbers favored him when you accounted for our wounded. He may have thought that humans, under real pressure in a real engagement, would make the choice that his data suggested we would make. He was about to find out how wrong that data was. What followed is the part of the story that Thesavril described in her memoir as the moment that changed everything we thought we understood. She wasn't there. She's working from the recorded footage, our helmet cams, the junction's own internal systems, which survived intact, and from the testimony of people who were. But she described it with a clarity that I thought was accurate enough to be worth including here. She wrote, what the Wrath commander failed to account for was not human firepower. It was human coordination under chaotic conditions. The 14 humans in that junction room did not act as separate individuals making separate threat assessments. They acted as one organism with 14 arms, making simultaneous decisions that nested inside each other without any apparent communication overhead. We reviewed the footage many times. We could not find the moment where instructions were given, because we believe that, for the most part, instructions were not given. The humans read each other and the environment and coordinated through some mechanism we still do not fully understand. Some of it was training. Some of it was something else. Something older. What she's describing is what happens when you train together long enough that you stop needing to speak. When the person next to you is a known variable and the threat is the unknown, and your only job is to find the geometry that puts the unknown at a disadvantage. We had trained together for 2 years before Karath. Some of us had been in the field together before that. Danny and I had been in the same unit for 6 years. You get to know how someone moves, where they'll be, what they'll do with an opening when one appears. The Wrath commander tried to take the room in a standard 4-way suppression pattern. It's a documented tactic, one of their most effective in open environments. You push from opposite sides, force the defenders to choose angles, create crossfire opportunities. It worked against Verk Watch units, apparently. Tavrak Essler's people were well trained, but they were also, under standard military doctrine, expected to operate from established defensive positions with sensor support. They were good at holding ground they had prepared. We were good at something different. We were good at being where we weren't expected. I'm going to describe 4 specific things that happened in the next 90 seconds, because I think they illustrate the point better than any general statement could. First, Bren Vasquez, who had come in from the corridor directly opposite the Wrath entry point, should have been their primary suppression target. He was exposed, badly positioned in their direct line. Instead of attempting to find cover, there wasn't much to find. He did something that I have since discussed with military theorists who describe it as tactically inadvisable but situationally brilliant. He ran at them, not straight at them. 45 degrees off the approach vector, moving fast enough that their targeting systems, calibrated for covering fire and positional suppression, not for fast-moving individual threats at oblique angles, couldn't track him cleanly. He went underneath their first volley and came up inside their formation and was simply somewhere that their doctrine said an enemy should not be. Second, Danny Hiroshi from my corridor saw the Wrath leftmost pair swinging to cover Bren and left her own covered position to take that angle. This left her exposed. She knew it. She did it anyway because she had already calculated that the Wrath rightmost pair was going to be occupied with Orla's element coming in from the 4th corridor, and that the window she had to cover Bren's angle was exactly as long as that distraction lasted, and not 1 second more. She was right. She hit both of her targets in that window and was back behind cover before the rightmost pair could redirect. Third, Tamaz Reyes, who was with Alpha Element, not supposed to be in direct combat, who was there to handle technical problems and not tactical ones, picked up a weapon from a downed Wrath soldier on the approach corridor, and contributed 2 shots that, reviewing the footage, did more to disrupt the Wrath commander's coordination than any single thing any of the actual combat specialists did. Tamaz maintains to this day that he just pointed it at the thing that needed to stop happening and made it stop. He is the most understated person I have ever met. Fourth, I went for the power hub. Not to destroy it, to lock it. There's an emergency isolation procedure for the Section 9 power hub. It's in the station technical manual, which I had read on our 3rd day aboard because I read everything and Orla had told us to know the station. The isolation procedure takes 15 seconds to initiate and seals the hub behind 3 independent security locks, none of which can be bypassed without station master codes. If I could initiate it, the Wrath's primary objective became inaccessible, and the entire tactical rationale for their boarding action collapsed. Getting to the hub control panel meant crossing about 6 meters of open floor, while a firefight was happening around me. I crossed it. I don't know exactly how. I know that 3 rounds hit the floor within about a meter of my path, and 1 hit the panel itself, destroying the manual input on the right side. I know that my arm, the one that had been grazed earlier, was protesting loudly by this point. I know that I initiated the isolation procedure left-handed, using the secondary panel input that most people don't know exists because it's labeled in the station's original Werk technical notation and not in trade standard. I had read the Werk technical notation. It was on page 47 of the station manual, which I had read because I had nothing else to do on a boring inter-corridor patrol. 15 seconds. They felt longer. The power hub sealed. 94 seconds total, that's what the footage showed. 94 seconds from first contact in the junction room to the moment the Wrath commander signaled withdrawal. 6 of the 9 Wrath personnel in that room were down. 3 were withdrawing in the direction of their breach craft. The power hub was sealed. The boarding action had failed. We had 3 additional wounded from the junction engagement, none life-threatening, all functional. We had not lost anyone. I sat down on the floor next to the power hub housing because my legs had decided they were done standing, and I held my injured arm against my chest, and I breathed. Danny appeared and crouched next to me. She looked at my arm. "You're bleeding through the field wrap," she said. "I know. You ran across an active firefight to read a maintenance panel." "That's accurate." She looked at me for a moment. Her face did something complicated. Then she said, "You read the Werk notation." "Page 47. She was quiet for a second. "You're such a nerd," she said. "I know." Orla's voice on the comm. "All elements status." I reported. Bren reported. The 3 elements accounting for each other, tallying up what was gone and what remained and what still needed doing. All of us present. All of us functional. Part 4, the morning after the myth died. The Wrath withdrawal craft launched from hull sections 14 and 22, approximately 18 minutes after the junction engagement. Section 9's craft remained docked, not abandoned, but its crew had sealed themselves inside and were not responding to communications. Later analysis suggested they were conducting an internal argument about whether to breach again or cut losses. They cut losses. The craft undocked and followed the others into the dark. The battle, if you want to call it that, and the military historians have, so I suppose you should, was over. What remained was the aftermath. The aftermath of a battle is not like the battle. The battle has a terrible clarity to it. The aftermath is murky and full of sensations that the clarity was suppressing. The physical pain that your body was politely not fully reporting, while you still needed to function. The emotional weight of what you've just been through. The specific exhaustion that comes not from physical effort alone, but from having operated at the absolute edge of your cognitive and emotional capacity for an extended period. I sat on the floor of Section 9 Junction for about 4 minutes before I stood up again. That's the most honest accounting I can give you. And then I stood up, because there was work to do. The Sharath Watch had suffered 17 casualties in the Section 31 explosion. 7 were fatal. 10 were wounded, ranging from critical to moderate. The survivors, including Tavrak Essler, who had been on the far side of the primary ops room when the charge detonated and had been protected by the bulk of the command console, were alive because the station's emergency containment systems had sealed the most damaged section before the atmosphere vented. Tavrak Essler was conscious when Orla's element reached him. He had a concussion, a fractured secondary arm, and the specific expression of a person who has had their fundamental assumptions about reality rearranged at considerable speed. What he said to Orla, according to her account, was, I need to understand what happened." Orla said, "What happened is we secured the station." He said, "How many?" And then he stopped because he was doing the math. He had 40 soldiers, of which 33 were now casualties. She had 23 soldiers, of which 7 were wounded, none fatally. He did that math. And then he did the other math, the math about what had been secured, and what the human element had covered while his command structure was down, and what the outcome would have been if Section 9 had gone the way the Wrath had planned. He said very quietly, "I did not think." "No," Orla said, "you didn't." And then, because Orla was Orla, "I need your access codes for the station's emergency broadcast system. We need to let the civilian personnel know the threat has been neutralized." He gave her the codes. I was doing the rounds of our wounded when the first Verk civilian came out of their quarters. His name was Fennec Dar, and he was a xenobiologist. I later learned, specializing in lower atmosphere microbial forms. He was about 60 years old by Verk reckoning, which made him somewhat younger than that in human terms, and he was wearing a sleep robe and looking at me with an expression I didn't entirely know how to classify. He looked at my arm, which was wrapped and had been redressed, but was still obviously an arm that had recently been shot. He said in careful trade standard, "You need medical attention." "Our medic is handling the priority cases first," I said. "I'm fine." He looked at me for another moment. Then he said, very formally, "My name is Fennec Dar. I am a research scientist. I am not a medical professional. But I have basic trauma training, which is required for all station personnel, and I am offering to help if it is useful." I looked at him. His hands were shaking very slightly, the aftermath of adrenaline or fear or both. He was standing in a corridor that smelled of a firefight, offering help. "Voss," I said, "Kill Voss, and yes, that would be useful, thank you." He helped me redress the arm. He was good at it, better than I expected. And while he worked, he said in a quieter voice, "I was watching from my quarters window when you passed through." "I know," I said. A pause. "I was afraid," he said, "but not when I saw you the fear changed." He searched for the word in trade standard, seemed to not find it, and said something in Verk that I later had translated. The translator gave me the trade standard equivalent as became directional. Fear with a direction, fear that knows where to point itself. I think about that phrase sometimes, became directional. "That's what it's supposed to do," I said. He finished wrapping my arm. He did it very carefully. The next 6 hours were logistics. Getting the civilian personnel into the central hub for a proper status briefing. Coordinating with the HEC command channel, which we had been able to reach through the backup communications array once Tamaz had routed around the Section 31 damage. Managing the medical situation. Our medic, Corporal Fatima Al-Rashid, had been working continuously since the first contact, and was doing things with a field kit that her instructor at the HEC Medical Training Center would have described as technically outside doctrine, but demonstrably effective. Devrak Solis, the administrative director, emerged at about 800. He had the specific demeanor of a bureaucrat who has survived something for which his bureaucratic frameworks were entirely insufficient. He spoke to Orla. I was nearby, writing up incident notes on a tablet, and I heard most of it. He said, "I need a complete accounting of all personnel actions taken during the security incident." Orla said, "Of course. I'll have the report to you within 24 hours. The actions taken by your personnel were outside the scope of assigned responsibilities." Orla looked at him for a moment, very steadily. "Yes, they were. The Sherath Watch had primary responsibility for external threat monitoring and response, yes. The external threat monitoring failed. The Watch suffered 17 casualties in the initial contact. The remaining security response fell to my personnel. A beat. We responded." Devrak was quiet for a moment. Then he said with the kind of effort that costs something, "The civilians on this station are alive because of what your unit did. I am aware of that." Orla nodded, yes. He seemed to want to say more. He seemed to be struggling with the distance between what he'd believed about us and what he was being required to incorporate. I watched it on his face and felt something that wasn't quite satisfaction, more like recognition. The recognition of a gap closing. "I would like to include a formal commendation in the incident report," he said finally. "That's appreciated," Orla said, "but not necessary. We were doing our jobs." He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. For 3 months, he said, I assigned your unit to inner corridor patrol and cargo verification, Orla said. I know, those are important functions, we performed them. Another long pause. I made assumptions, he said, that were incorrect, Orla said. And then she said something that I've thought about many times, and that I think is the most important thing anyone said in the entire Karath incident. But we don't hold assumptions against people, Director. We hold actions. And the most important action anyone can take after holding an incorrect assumption is to revise it. That's what intelligence looks like. That's what being in contact with reality looks like. Devrak Solis stood in the corridor of a station his people had underestimated, talking to the commanding officer of the unit he had underestimated, and I watched him do the thing that is genuinely hard and genuinely necessary. He revised. Tavrak Essler found me at about 1100, while I was reviewing the incident log and waiting for my turn with Fatima and her field kit. He had a bandage on his head, his secondary arm was immobilized, and he was moving with the care of someone who knows that rapid movements are currently a bad idea. He sat down across from me and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I reviewed the corridor footage from the junction engagement. Okay, I said. 94 seconds. Approximately. He was quiet again. Then, I want to ask you something, and I want you to understand that it is a genuine question, not a challenge. Okay. In our pre-deployment assessments of human combat units, he said, we worked from documented performance data, historical engagement records, physiological profiles. The assessment concluded that humans were adequate, capable of fulfilling auxiliary security functions. Not the primary response category for a significant hostile action. He paused. The assessment was wrong. I want to understand specifically why it was wrong, not as a post-incident administrative matter. I want to genuinely understand. I thought about it, not about what to say, about how to say it accurately. The assessment probably had good data, I said. Good historical records, good physiology, good averages. The mistake is in what you conclude from averages. Meaning humans under average conditions perform averagely. Humans under extreme conditions. I stopped. The physiological profile of the human stress response in acute threat situations is it does things that aren't captured in baseline measurements. It's not that we become superhuman. We don't. We become very specifically optimized for one thing, survival. And survival for us historically meant not just surviving alone, but surviving together. Because we couldn't survive alone. We evolved in an environment where if you didn't coordinate with your group under extreme pressure, you died. So that coordination under extreme pressure it's not a trained behavior alone. It's much older than training. Tavrak was listening with all 4 eyes, which sounds like a small thing but isn't. For a Verk, it's a specific posture of attention, something like the way humans lean forward. The assessment, he said, modeled human unit performance based on individual capability metrics. Yes, I said, that's the mistake. He was quiet for a long time. We have a concept, he said slowly, in Verk military doctrine, composite formation capability. The idea that a unit in optimal conditions can exceed the sum of its individual members. It's considered an advanced training objective, something achieved after extensive specialized work. Right, I said. You're telling me that for human units under sufficient pressure, this is not an advanced objective. It's a baseline response. That's what I'm telling you. He sat with that for a while. Then he said, how do you train for it? You train together for a long time, I said. And you go through difficult things together, and you trust each other. The trust is the thing, everything else is downstream of the trust. He looked at me, then he looked down at the table. Then he said, very quietly, I did not trust your unit. No. I assigned you. Inner corridor patrol, I know. Another long silence. I am sorry, he said. For what it is worth from someone in my position, I made an assessment and the assessment was wrong and the consequences of that wrongness were I lost people. And you, he stopped. Your people were better positioned to respond than mine were, and they were positioned further from the threat because of how I arranged the defensive responsibilities, if I had allocated differently. Then we'd have been in a different position and something else would have happened and we can't know what, I said. That's not a useful chain of reasoning. No, a pause, but it is an honest one. Yes, I said. It is. We sat there for a minute. Two soldiers in the aftermath of something, doing the thing that soldiers do afterward, which is try to process and understand and carry forward. Then Tavrak said, I would like, when this is over and the reports are filed and the investigations are complete, to have a longer conversation about human military doctrine. I'd like that too, I said. Part 5, What the Myth Was Made Of. The investigators came. They always come after something like this. Verk Conclave Security Review, HEC After Action Analysis, Joint Incident Committees with acronyms I've already forgotten. They spent 3 weeks on Karath asking questions and reviewing footage and constructing timelines and producing reports that were, by all accounts, thorough. I gave my testimony. All of us did. Orla's account was, characteristically, precise and complete and slightly more honest about the chaos of the operation than the review committee was probably hoping for. She told them the part about running across the active firefight to read a maintenance panel, my part, and included the note that this was tactically unconventional but situationally necessary and ultimately decisive. Which is about as much credit as I expected from Orla, and exactly as much credit as I needed. Devrak Solis's report included the formal commendation he had mentioned. He had written it himself, which I only found out later, and it was thorough, in the way that a person who is genuinely trying to correct a record writes thoroughly. Tavrak Essler's testimony included a section on the pre-incident defensive allocation, and its failures that I understand was difficult to write, and is now required reading at the Verk Military Academy's cross-species operations curriculum. He wrote it anyway. He's like that. 3 months after Karath, the Galactic Conclave called a review session on the status of human military units in joint operations. I was not present for it. Orla was, representing the HEC, along with several senior officers and the Civilian Oversight Committee. The outcome of that review session was a revised Joint Operations Protocol that significantly altered the allocation of responsibilities in mixed human-Verk installations. Human units were, under the new protocol, to be assessed on the basis of composite unit capability rather than individual physiological metrics. Defensive responsibilities were to be allocated based on terrain response fitness rather than prestige ranking. It's a dry document, the kind that gets cited in other dry documents. It doesn't read like what it actually was, which was a civilization revising a fundamental assumption about another civilization. It was the moment the myth that humans were adequate but decorative, capable but not crucial, officially ended. Not in combat. Not in the moment at Karath when the junction footage showed 14 humans moving like one thing. In a committee room on the Conclave Capital Station. In a document that used the language of military protocol to say something much simpler. We were wrong about them. I've thought a lot over the years about why the myth existed in the first place. It's tempting to frame it as simple arrogance, the Verk being too proud or too certain of their own capabilities to see us accurately. That framing is too easy and too unfair. The Verk are not an arrogant species. They are a careful species, methodical. They observe data and draw conclusions. The myth of human adequacy but not more wasn't born from pride. It was born from a data set that didn't include the right conditions. You can observe humans for 11 years in the context of diplomatic exchange, trade protocol, academic collaboration, and routine security management. You can measure reaction times and strength profiles and stress hormone baselines. You can review historical conflict records and calculate casualty rates and model unit performance under standard conditions. And you will get data. Real, accurate data. And you will still miss the thing that matters. Because the thing that matters doesn't show up until the conditions are extreme. The Verk had evolved in a gentler environment. They had not needed to develop the specific adaptation that extreme conditions unlock in humans. They had not evolved the wiring that turns fear into coordination. That makes a unit of 14 people read each other in 94 seconds without visible communication. That makes a person run across a firefight to read a maintenance panel in a language they learned on page 47 of a manual they read on a boring night shift. They had not evolved it, and so they didn't look for it, and when they measured us, they measured the wrong things. The myth wasn't a lie, it was a gap in the measurement. Thesavril Kian published her memoir about 4 years after Karath. I've already quoted from it, and I'll quote from it one more time, because the end of it is the best statement I've found of what I've been trying to say. She wrote in the final chapter, "What we called a myth, the idea of the human warrior, the human who performs best when everything is worst, who holds when holding should be impossible, who coordinates in chaos as though chaos were their native environment, was not a myth. It was something we could not measure with our instruments. The instruments were real. The measurements were accurate. The mistake was in believing that what our instruments could not detect did not exist. The humans at Karath did not prove anything new. They proved what was already true. We simply had not had the proper conditions to see it. The myth was never the humans. The myth was our certainty that we had understood them." I read that passage to Danny when the book came out. We were in a bar on a transit station somewhere between Saul and Verk Prime, and she read it twice, and then she put the tablet down and picked up her drink and said nothing for about 30 seconds. Then she said, "Huh. And then you think she's right." And I said, "I think she's being generous. She's calling it a measurement problem. It was also a respect problem." And Danny said, "Yeah, but she's Verk. This is about as far as they go when they're admitting they were wrong." I thought about that. "Fair enough," I said. We drank to it, not to being right, not to proving anything. To the people we'd lost in Section 31, and to the 7 Sherath Watch soldiers who died because the assumptions were wrong, and to the revision of those assumptions. To what happens when the myth meets reality and reality wins. Part 6, What Remains. I left active HEC service 5 years after Karath. Not because of what happened there. If anything, Karath gave me more reasons to stay than to go. I left because there was other work that seemed to need doing, and because Orla had retired and Tamaz had gone into the private sector doing things with sensor networks that he won't fully explain to anyone, and because Danny had taken a commission with the new joint Human-Verk security coordination body that grew out of the Karath Review, and because the unit that had been that unit was no longer quite that unit anymore. Units have lives like people do. They form and grow and change, and eventually become something different from what they were, even if they keep the same name. I knew when ours had changed. I took a position at the HEC Training Center on Kepler Station, working on the Combined Operations curriculum, working on exactly the things that Tavrak Essler had asked me about in that corridor at 1100 on the morning after Karath. How to train for composite unit capability. How to build the trust that makes the coordination possible. How to measure the things that standard instruments miss. I've been there for 8 years now. Every intake of new trainees goes through what we call the Karath module, a study of the incident, the footage, the after-action reports, the testimony, not as a heroic narrative. As a case study in what human units can do when conditions are extreme, and what it takes to build and maintain that capability, and what happens when the people who are supposed to support them don't understand what they're looking at. The trainees ask me, sometimes, what it felt like. I tell them the same thing every time. I tell them it didn't feel like history. There's one more thing I want to tell you. Something that didn't make it into the official reports because it wasn't material to the tactical or strategic assessment. On the last day of the investigation, 3 weeks after the incident, the evening before the committee and its staff were set to depart, there was a small gathering in the station's common area. Informal. Someone had produced what passes for food and drink when you're at a remote logistics waypoint, and about 40 people, Verk Watch survivors, my unit, some of the civilian scientific staff, ended up in the same space at the same time. Fennec Dar, the xenobiologist who had helped redress my arm the morning after, sat down next to me. We had talked several times during the investigation period. He was, I had found, an extremely interesting person, the kind of scientist who is curious about everything and has the patience to follow curiosity wherever it leads. We had talked about xenobiology and about HEC training and about human evolutionary history and about the specific chemistry of the stress response, which he found fascinating. He sat down next to me in the common area, and we sat for a while without saying anything, watching the mixture of human and Verk personnel managing the social complexity of sharing a space after a shared experience. Then he said, "Can I ask you something personal?" "Sure." "When you were in the middle of it, the fighting, were you afraid?" "Yes," I said, "very." "And you kept moving anyway?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. I have been studying the academic literature on human threat response since the incident, the neurological mechanisms, the evolutionary history. I understand, I think, what is happening physiologically. He paused. But I find I still cannot imagine what it feels like to be afraid and to choose, despite the fear, to move toward the thing causing it. I thought about how to answer that. It doesn't feel like a choice exactly, I said. It's more like the fear shows you the direction, and then there's something else, something that says this way, and you go. He was quiet for a long time. What is the something else? He asked. What do you call it? I sat with that. I don't know if it has a single name, I said. The closest I've come is the part of you that remembers why you're there, not abstractly, specifically, the faces, the people behind the corridor doors. The reason the direction matters. Fennec Dar looked at me with those 4 Verk eyes, all 4, in the full attention posture. He said, that is what we did not understand about you. And I said, yeah. And we sat there in the common area of Karath Station, humans and Verk in the same space, and the lights of the system's nearest planet made a pale streak across the observation port, and somewhere behind us someone was laughing at something. I never found out what, and the sound of it in that space, after everything, was the best thing I heard all week. A myth is a story a species tells about something it doesn't yet understand. When you understand it, the myth doesn't disappear. It becomes something else. It becomes part of the record, part of the evidence. The Verk had a myth about humans. They told it to themselves for 11 years. This story about adequate but unexceptional beings, capable but not crucial, useful in their way but not the thing you call when the real problem arrives. And then the real problem arrived. And the myth became real. Not because humans are superhuman. Not because we don't break, don't bleed, don't fear. We do all of those things. We are built out of all of those things. But we are also built out of something else. Something that goes all the way back to the first humans who figured out that you survive better together than alone, and who wired that understanding so deep into our biology that it doesn't require conscious decision. Something that extreme conditions don't destroy but activate. They laughed at the myth of humans. And then they stopped laughing. And Fennec Dar wrapped my arm, and Tavrek Essler asked how to train for it, and Thesavril Kian wrote her memoir, and Devrak Solis wrote his commendation, and the committees filed their reports, and the Joint Operations Protocol was revised. And somewhere in the training centers and the briefing rooms and the curriculum documents of the Verk Military Academy, the myth became something that is no longer called a myth. It's called a documented capability. And somewhere else, in a bar on a transit station, at a table over drinks, in a quiet moment after a long debrief, it's called something simpler. Just the truth.